Hello, thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm really excited to share this training on working effectively with state agencies as researchers. So today we're going to have the opportunity to discuss a variety of different topics and knowledge and skills that we believe will support you in your efforts to work directly with state agencies, both here in Pennsylvania and for those of you joining from other states and other states around the country. At its heart, we wanted to frame this challenge and frame the challenge of working with state agencies from your perspective as researchers who are interested in how one goes about actually engaging with state agencies, building relationship with state agencies, translating and communicating your science to those agencies, and ultimately building partnerships that are effective and supportive of both the state agency's goals as well as your own goals for scientific impact. We'll be talking about different elements of working with state agencies, including aligning their research with your research with real decision-making systems. We'll talk a little bit about what agencies must do, including state agencies' efforts to translate their policy goals into operational actions that shape programs, services, and understanding of populations, often under really intense operational constraints. And we'll talk a little bit more about those in a moment. We'll also talk about why your scientific evidence alone is not enough. Agencies weigh scientific evidence alongside budgets, politics, statutory authority, timelines, implementation capacity, and understanding these contexts is essential to being useful to those agencies and also accomplishing your own goals for that engagement. And all of this is seen through the lens of relationships. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as well, and the importance of relationship management and how one goes about building those relationships. But it's important from the get-go that we really emphasize why evidence alone isn't enough. Further, we'll talk about reframing engagement and what engagement really means. So this training seeks to emphasize that operating and supporting agency staff and agency systems involves this element of building trust, reliability, and as I mentioned before, relationship management. So research supports decisions that ultimately lead to action, not just communication, not just sort of increasing knowledge. And then ultimately, what this sets up is a focus for ahead for aligning your research contributions with how decisions are going to be made. And then also, we want to, through this training, support your efforts to be able to better diagnose decision contexts and package your evidence in decision-ready formats. And we'll talk more about what decision-ready means. So this training is going to cover then the effort is our effort to support your initial growth, or for some of you who may be expert in this, and this is just a refresher, for building practical and applied skills for engaging with state agencies in ways that really increase research use. So what you're going to learn is how agencies actually make decisions in real world contexts, what agencies need from researchers to act on that evidence, how to build and maintain those relationships and support sustained engagement, and then ultimately how to communicate research to support decisions. The central shift, though, is moving from sharing your research to actually supporting action, which involves adjusting timing, formatting, and framing to agency priorities versus the assumptions you may have coming in. And so examples throughout are going to show how small adjustments can significantly increase the usefulness of evidence and whether responding to requests, initiating engagement in the first place, or sustaining long-term partnerships really makes sense. So by the end, the learning goal here includes that participants should be better positioned as valuable partners in decision-making systems, not just external experts delivering reports. So, getting to the core problem, researchers yourselves are trained to prioritize rigor, precision, the peer review process, and these norms advance science. They are essential to what makes high quality, rigorous science, but they don't neatly fit into agency decision environments. And that's what this comes down to is not just the translation or engagement for engagement's sake, but ultimately supporting those decision environments, right? And the decision making of agencies. What agencies need is different. State agencies act under tight timeframes. They often deal with incomplete information and are comfortable with it. And they have a high to mid-level amount of public accountability, depending on the visibility and the political sensitivity of the issue area they're working on. But most importantly, they need usable, timely guidance that fits the legal, political, and operational constraints of their agency, right? Just because they may want to do something doesn't mean that they can. And understanding that and not bringing them sort of solutions that they can't act on is a key part of the lesson, which we want folks to take away from these trainings. The consequence is that high quality research, as many of you know, often goes unused, and it's not for a lack of value. It's not for certainly not for a lack of rigor, but it's because it isn't delivered in the right form at the right time. The core issue is ultimately alignment between evidence production and decision needs. So that leads to this sort of key idea that this work, the work of policy engagement and engaging effectively with state agencies, is a systems challenge. Working with state agencies is not just a communication effort, right? And that's something that's really important. We're big fans of science communication. We engage in a number of different studies to understand how to better frame science and communicate it, but that is not even half the battle, as they say. Researchers enter this system, right, and sort of the engagement context with their own incentives, maybe little incentives, maybe lots of incentives, right? Maybe personal goals, maybe external goals, maybe institutional goals. They also have their own timelines, right? They're operating on P&T timelines. You may have a project that is a dissemination component. That's why you're engaging, but it's a 5-year grant, right? And that timing of when you might disseminate your work may or may not align with the timelines of state agencies. And importantly, there's different definitions of what counts as useful. The thing that you think might be most useful and the most important breakthrough discovery may not be what your state agency, right, or the most relevant state agency actually cares about. In many cases, the information that is most of interest, at least initially with state agencies, is descriptive. They're often working with that incomplete information and don't understand or don't know exactly what's happening on the ground. Your etiologic, your mechanistic information can also be really valuable. And it may be more valuable than, for instance, the main effect of your intervention study, at least at the beginning, right? And that's an important thing to remember. Further, agencies operate within, as I mentioned before, a statutory authority, right? That is the legal mandate of what they can and can't do. And that's really important, right? Because those statutory authorities are what both gives an agency power, but also limits that power. And that's important, right? As citizens, we don't want state agencies that have unlimited, unchecked power. But as researchers, we have to understand what that statutory authority is, preferably before you're even in the room, right? And by understanding what they can and cannot do and what levers are or not at their disposal is really important so that you have the most effective, useful conversations. Further, I'm sure that this is big on many folks' mind. Political leadership and political priorities absolutely rule the day, right? They may be more or less pronounced depending on the substantive policy area that you're engaging in, but they absolutely are there. And political, as I'll say a couple times, does not necessarily mean partisan, right? But it does refer to the larger idea that there is individuals in power, right, who dictate what the priorities are of the moment. And sometimes that means the thing that you care about is not a priority. And that means that you may either not be talking to the right people within that agency, or maybe you need to go and engage with political leadership, like a governor's office, right, as opposed to dealing with an agency if the political priorities are misaligned. Further, the operational realities are omnipresent. Most state agencies are largely under-resourced for their mandate and for what they are, from a legal standpoint, required to do. So anything that is extra, anything that is not a requirement, often is hard to justify. And that's a really key element too, is that if you're going to be making a case for why an agency needs to pay attention to this thing, right? Or this population or this dynamic that you study, before you're even in the room, you need to think about how, again, it aligns with their legal priorities and their political priorities, so that you can understand the operational realities. Because if you're bringing a nice to have, then the response you're going to get is very different than I can help you as a scientist. I can help you meet your both political priorities and in the context of the statutory authority and your statutory mandates. So success requires adapting to that system rather than expecting the system to adapt to academic norms, right? This is probably not a surprise to folks, but you will be surprised at yourself. As for those of you that have already engaged, you may have already experienced this, and for those of you who are new to engaging with state agencies, you'll find yourself being frustrated by the process, and it can be really demoralizing. But the reality is that this system exists and operates totally outside of the academic norms and the expectations that you might have for timelines, or how easy something should be, or how difficult something should be. And it's often us that need to change our expectations. The researchers need to change the expectations as opposed to expecting them to change. And it's really easy to fall into that sort of trap of being frustrated because the norms are different. So, but you can be less frustrated when you understand how decisions are actually triggered, who actually has authority to act, and what constraints limit the options of how you can engage. Agencies often value relevance and feasibility, and most importantly, timeliness. And you'll hear me talk about this till you're sick, probably. But timeliness is so important. You need to show up within the right window. In the realm of political science and public policy research, we often refer to these as like Overton windows or policy windows. Um, these are the moments when change can actually happen. And understanding those as a researcher is incredibly important because that's when things get done, right? If you show up too early or if you show up too late, right, when a statute is being changed or a regulatory framework is being changed or a new political leadership is coming in, then you may miss that window. So viewing engagement as system navigation, your engagement with state agencies as you're navigating a system, is going to support more strategic choices about how and when you engage and what information is provided and how to frame it. And so that's just another one of these elements that your engagement experience and the effectiveness of your engagement is going to be depend upon partially, can you meet and show up under the norms not of your academic context or your research context for those of you outside maybe traditional academic spaces, and instead show up in the context of when they need you and in what ways they need you. And you can also kind of manage your own frustrations at that the norms are not the same, right, as you normally experience them. And sometimes those can be quite unconscious. They can be very deeply embedded in us, especially us academics. So this shifts the focus from perfect messaging, right, and working forever on the perfect policy brief to aligning contributions with those decision process. It also, and I cannot emphasize this enough, underscores the need for humility and a learning mindset. You need to show up with the mindset that you're going to learn as much from them as you're going to teach them. And many of us are all, in addition to being experts in our fields, are also instructors and teachers and educators. And it's so easy to fall into, oh, I'm going to go and talk to these folks and educate them on something. And the reality is like, they generally don't feel like they need to be educated. And if they do, it's within a very specific and limited area. And if you show up being a know-it-all, you're just falling into the stereotype of many, many, many academics who've come before you who show up and they might have important, interesting information, but the message just doesn't get across because we often lack humility in these spaces. And so it's important to not put up all of the armor, right, as you walk into these rooms because you may feel uncomfortable and you're trying to prove to them how expert you are, and instead come in with a openness and a humility and a readiness to learn. So embracing this system, these system views really sets the stage for more productive and sustained partnerships.